Hello, good evening. It's Metta Spencer here in Toronto, and we're going to have some fun. At least I'm going to have a good time talking with somebody I really like to talk to, and that is Karen Hamilton. Karen, I've known not so awfully long. I don't remember how I met you, but I know that for ages, 20 years or so, you were the leading person in the World Federalist Movement in Canada. And I think we ran into each other in Kuching in one of those conferences. Mm-hmm. And at that time, you were probably already the executive director, or no, it's a
general secretary
of the Canadian Council of Churches, worthy organization, I would say. And you've been through with that about a year or so, as I understand. And I've been doing wonderful other things like taking tours of Israel and Palestine. In case you're interested in going on a tour with Karen, I would advocate that. And she's been involved with the leaders.
Interfaith Leaders Summit.
Interfaith Leaders Summit, which apparently meets whenever the G20 and G8 get together.
Or G7 now, I think we probably need to say.
That's certainly true. Okay, and they get together and talk about how to make the world a better place.
Indeed.
Indeed. And in addition to that, Karen is organizing, I guess is the main organizer for this Parliament of World Religions, which is coming up in November. We'll be here in Toronto. And I understand you're expecting something like 10,000
10,000 people.
Wow. That looks like a task to manage. So I feel very privileged to get a few minutes of her time. But at any rate, hello, Karen.
Well, hello, Metta. I am delighted to be a part of this conversation. As you said, just when we were talking before we started, this is a conversation. I'm delighted to be a part of it.
Very good. Well, let's plunge right into it. I think, do we want to talk a little bit about the World Federalists?
Yeah.
Or do we want to,
let's start there. Because you're right. We met at Kuching, the Kuching Institute on Public Affairs, which is very relevant to everything we're talking about too, because for over 80 years, it was a place in Canada where it was called a civil place to disagree. So people would talk about really substantive issues and not be afraid to disagree with one another and to deepen the conversation that way. And it was about deep conversation, which I think is what you and I are also about in this conversation tonight, and which we are encouraging everyone who's listening, and indeed the whole society, our whole society, which is the name of another conference, actually. For those of you listening, look it up on the internet. It's
called
Our Whole Society is a conference. It's a fairly new creation, which I had a hand in creating and got to chair for a number of iterations. It's going into its fourth iteration, which is actually also going to be in Toronto, I think in 2019, and it brings together a entirely wide spectrum of folk to talk about what the role of religion in society should be, could be. And it brings, religious practitioners, but it also brings academics, and it brings politicians, and it brings those who are not entirely certain about what they think about religion at all. It brings those who would not consider they have any faith background, but understand that most people in the world, and contrary to a popular myth out there, most people in Canada as well, have some kind of connection with a faith tradition. So it's a very interesting conference because the discussion is deep and painful, and people disagree with each other there, very much. But it's been a standing room only for the last three iterations. And as I said, 2019, look for that in Toronto.
It's going to be in Toronto. Is it normally in Toronto?
No, it's all over the country. It's been in Montreal. It's been in Ottawa. It's been in Vancouver. But 2019.
Sign me up. I want to come.
No. All right, sign you up. Okay, so let's go back though and talk about the World Federalists. So first you and I met at Kuching, and then we talked about our whole society. World Federalists, I would never call myself the leading figure in the World Federalist movement, not by a long shot. But I have done what I could to be helpful in the World Federalist movement. And one of the skills that I bring is an ability to chair meetings and be kind of a process governance geek on occasion and let people know that they can't move a motion and do things by consensus at the same moment, at the same meeting, things like that. But I am deeply committed to the World Federalist Organization and have been since 1996. And then I became council chair actually in 1996 and have been committed internationally as well, and was on the international executive until this past summer. So that is very much a part of who I am and the work I do. And everything interconnects, Metta, like everything you've mentioned in terms of the things that I've been interested in and working on are all interconnected. So, World Federalists have a vision of a world that is just and where there is global governance and where we are able as people, as regions, as countries, as a globe to work at whatever is the most appropriate level, subsidiarity we call it, to bring to fruition a world that is better for all. Mm-hmm. And we do that through the International Criminal Court and Responsibility to Protect and Law of the Sea and many, many World Federalist initiatives. So I also send any listeners who aren't already dyed-in-the-wool World Federalists to look up the World Federalist movement in Canada and globally. And it is really one of the few, if not the only organization that truly understands global governance and how we can govern ourselves in a way that is, as I said, a feature of subsidiarity. And it's just that not everyone is a huge fan or knows how to spell that word. But it talks about decisions being made at the appropriate level. Mm-hmm. And this is really important because it's a complex theory in a way, but it's the only theory. And so that's been very much a part and continues to be. I continue to be on the board of directors for the World Federalist Movement Canada and continue to be as active as I can in that. So that's a starting place in a way that was an obvious starting place for me coming out of a long-standing past of justice commitment. And so, in the peace movement.
United Church minister.
I'm a United Church minister and had my own congregation for 8 years and then was called, recruited, encouraged to become General Secretary of the Canadian Council of Churches, which is unique. In Canada, we do like to be as unique as we can. And I don't know whether it exactly is just our geography. It's our history. John Ralston Saul talks about us being a Métis people. But the Canadian Council of Churches, unlike most church councils in the world, represents more than 85% of the Christians in Canada. There's much more fragmentation in many church councils in the world. And in Canada, the Roman Catholics are full members, which is not the case in most church councils.
I'm surprised that I didn't know that they would participate in that.
Absolutely. They have been full members since 1997. We also have many evangelical traditions. And that's something I always want to make a point of saying in any kind of a context, because what we see in the media is often a reflection of American evangelicalism, which is not the same. It's not the same in Canada. So you've got in Canada what are traditionally, it's not really a good term, but mainline denominations, and the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox traditions and most of the evangelical traditions all work together. Mm-hmm. They're all together in relationship. And this is quite unique and it works really, really well. So I had the privilege of being General Secretary for 15 years and it was a wonderful privilege. But after 15 years, it just seemed to me it was time to do some other things. But I much cherish that time and our ecumenical reality. And to say, for those who are listening, that the Canadian Council of Churches is the Christian churches working together, but lots of work was being done together with other faith traditions, particularly Judaism and Islam, and around the current issue and many others in Canada of palliative care. Many joint conversations around that, of course, around affordable housing, around poverty issues, around the absolute scourge of human trafficking, which is a much more of a reality in Canada than any Canadian wants to believe. We are actually a a conduit to the United States. We send and traffic women and young boys to the United States as sexual slaves or domestic slaves. And so this is something that all of the churches also have been deeply concerned about, all of the faith community. Yeah, I know. See, people don't know that, Metta. I know.
A little about that. I didn't.
Yeah.
This is a new topic for me.
Yeah.
What do you know about that? That's completely news to me.
I know, isn't it? And it's just horrible. And it's modern day slavery, and it exists. And if I explain it, there's a horrid logic to it. And there are traffickers. I mean, this is what they do for a living, is to make money selling women, girls, and young boys. And one of the methods that is used is to go to places around the world where people are living in poverty and to offer families a position, a job for their young girls in Canada, where they'll be able to have what is sold as a better life and send some money back home to their families. And people are starving. So
well, do the families realize what they are selling their girls in?
Probably not. No, probably not. Mm-hmm. Probably not. But they're also desperate because they're starving. And
where do most of these people, the girls or boys, come from?
Asia and Eastern Europe. Most, but also in Canada, and this has been a huge part of the Truth and Reconciliation conversations and, deep engagement in issues, and where there needs to be much more deep engagement. It's very much happening also in Indigenous communities, that women are being trafficked. And so, the highway of tears out on the West Coast in BC. I mean, this is a reality. So it's also very much a reality for Indigenous women, young girls, boys in Canada as well. So it's a terrible thing, and people don't know about it. It's making more press. When the churches got engaged in it, it was hardly known at all. But now, if you read the papers carefully, you will see an article from time to time, and certainly it comes up in the Truth and Reconciliation work quite strongly. What the answers are, it's hard to know. And there are things that can be done for sure, but it's tough. And so this is why you and I were talking before we started about why all issues are interconnected. Human trafficking very much feeds off situations of desperation and poverty.
Mm-hmm.
And
I've heard that just in passing, I've heard someone say that these women, Indigenous women who go missing and are presumably killed, many of them are prostitutes. That they were sex workers who were somehow on that highway. Well, I don't know why one highway has it, but is that the case? Or
well, I'm not an expert, so I don't want to say things that may or may not be reflecting the depths of the conversation. But I think part of the misunderstanding we have is we think of prostitution as a choice, and it just isn't.
As a what?
A choice. As a choice, and it just isn't. Right. Back to what I said about desperation and poverty. And I once met a young girl. I was actually on the border of Uganda and Tanzania, where the AIDS HIV crisis began. And now this is not Canada. This is far away, but the depth of the desperation was something I will never forget. So AIDS HIV was started there. And it's a situation where it's still very, very much, very real there as truckers stop and are held at the borders. And so there was a young girl who would sell herself to the truckers. And one of those, desperately trying to make a difference in her life and the lives of other young women said to her, but you know that if you continue to do this, you are going to get AIDS, HIV, and you will die, because at that point, the treatment was not so well. It's very available in Canada. It's not so available in many other countries, and exorbitantly expensive and unobtainable, and things like that. Complicated because proper nutrition and health clinics are also required to make it work properly. But anyway, she responded, yes. She said, I know full well that I will get this terrible disease and I will die. And probably in only a few years. But if I don't do this, my younger sisters and brothers won't eat. Mm-hmm. So she chose
Yeah.
She chose what the future she could see, which was going to be horrible and involve terrible suffering, so her younger siblings could eat. Mm. And so that we need to keep that kind of story in mind. But of course, it's very, very complicated. But it's one of the issues that of many that the churches are working on together. And so there is a resource for those who would like to go to the Canadian Council of Churches website. There is a resource on human trafficking there. And the first place to start is in terms of the education and becoming more aware, because it is happening in Canada. As I said, we are a conduit to the United States. There's also domestic slavery happening in Canada, where young women are brought in to act as housekeepers or nannies and treated just horribly. The hours are too long. The wages are poor. And if you start being very aware of that and what some of the signs are, it is shocking what you will observe in our own society. So, and this goes back to what I said about our whole society conference. This is something that Christian traditions are deeply concerned about. This is something that all faith traditions are deeply concerned about. This is something that people who are not a part of any faith tradition are deeply concerned about. So it's one of the places where, as a whole society, we can all work together, which is the same around World Federalism. There are quite a number of us who've had longstanding and prominent positions in the World Federalist movement who come out of faith tradition to do so, because we believe in a world where, in my tradition, one of the biblical phrases is often used is that everyone will live beneath their vine and fig tree and no one will be afraid. It comes from what Christians call the Old Testament. So everyone will have what they need in order to live, but by not being afraid, that's a sort of a wider definition than it might sound. It means that there will be dignity and there will be respect, and people can live in peace and they can be self-sufficient and yet in community, all at the same time. And so and I'm not saying the faith communities haven't fallen short on it. For sure they have, sometimes in horrific and terrible ways. But it is also the inspiration that calls us forward to be our better selves, better angels, as that book title goes.
And what you're saying is that these churches are all, the ones who you've been connected with, or the organization you've been involved with, has been very oriented towards social justice issues.
Social justice, relationship, understanding each other. There is often people, as you know well, don't know history perhaps as well as some of us who are history geeks might like. And so it's also about understanding and learning about each other. So we would also have at the Canadian Council of Churches presentations, the different faith traditions would present. And we would learn a great deal. And, when an obvious example is, and people, often reference the Crusades as one of the, pits of deep violence and misunderstanding that came out of the Christian tradition, the Crusades. And we all know that. One of the things less known is that in the rush of the Crusaders to Israel and Palestine, they went through many lands where there were many other Christians. So they were Latin and Western Christians, and they went through many lands where there were other kinds of Christians, Orthodox Christians, and didn't understand, and massacred those people and took many of the treasures. And so that if you go to visit, and I'm sure many people who are listening to this, the hundreds and thousands of people listening to this, many of them will have been to Istanbul. And if you go to Istanbul and you talk in any depth with a church leader or anyone of any faith tradition there, that memory of 1,000 years ago is still remembered, that the Western Crusaders ransacked Istanbul. So so learning about each other and our traditions, and repenting of past misunderstandings that led to terrible behavior, and figuring out how we move forward together. And this is really important to say that again, referencing our better angels, faith traditions exist not for themselves, but they exist for the healing and the mending of the world. And when we remember that, we work together with all people for the sake of creation and for the sake of all people.
Okay, you've got a very universalistic point of view, and this leads us right into this conference that you attended recently, I believe, of the faith leaders.
The Interfaith Leaders Summit, yeah.
So tell us about that summit, which I knew nothing about until you mentioned it just a few minutes ago.
Yeah, well, it's become quite a tradition, and it's kind of been happening in different ways. But a short version of the story, of course, there are always longer versions, is that in 2004, when it was then the G8, now, as I said, now it's the G7, and Trump, notwithstanding, trying to bring Russia back in, that suggestion has not been well received by the other G7 members. So it's certainly the G7 still. But when the G7 and the G20 were meeting, and particularly in that case, the G7 in the UK, there was, for the first time in 2004, there was a faith leaders summit that met in conjunction. Separate, completely independent, not in any way influenced by the G7 or, for that matter, the G20, but in that case, the G7, to talk about the issues of concern for the faith communities that the G7 was going to talk about. So pretty much every year, not every year, but most years since 2004, so we're now talking a 14-year tradition, there has been an Interfaith Leaders Summit that's brought faith leaders from all over the world, senior faith leaders, experts in different issues of peace, justice, climate, Millennium Development Goals, now the Sustainable Development Goals, has brought them together to talk with each other and then to issue a statement to the G7 or the G20. So this happened in 2004, 2005, 2006, 7, 8, 9, and 2010. People will remember that the G8 and the G20 were meeting in Canada. And so it was my privilege actually to be the sort of the energy source and the builder of a coalition of 47 members to host the Interfaith Leaders Summit, bring faith leaders from all around the world, from the G8 countries and from the G20 regions, to again come together, talk about the issues.
Were they in Toronto or
in Winnipeg? Actually, hosted at the University of Winnipeg. Lloyd Axworthy, who is president of the World Federalist Movement. James Christie, who was the dean at the Faculty of Theology at the time, and also a World Federalist. All of us collaborated to put this summit together, and bring these faith leaders from all around the world. And I mean, we had faith leaders from Lebanon. We had actually Raffi was there. Do you remember the children's performer Raffi? Remember Baby Beluga? Yeah. Baby Beluga in the deep blue sea. Anyway, he is very much an advocate for social justice, particularly around children, and has an organization. So he was actually there. And it was quite a funny moment when I was working with my staff and we were drawing up invitations, and one of my young staff came to me and said, Raffi, it can't be that Raffi. And I went, yes, it is. It's that Raffi. So he was there.
They normally meet, try to meet right close to the...
They do try to meet close to the summit. So here are some important learnings. But just before I go back to the learnings, which I really want people to hear about, they try to meet close to the summits. And the procession has kind of continued, but now it's more related to the G20, because the G20 has taken on more of the issues that the faith communities are concerned with, particularly poverty issues, justice issues, climate issues. Those are more dealt with by the G20 now. So the summits happen in conjunction with the G20, and a primary organizer is Brian Adams out of the Gold Coast in Australia, out of Griffith University. And so James Christie, has continued his work very much with that as well. And so the summits have kind of moved over, rightly so, most correctly, to be in relation to the G20. So, but here's learnings, and I am, watching our time, and there are so many interesting things to talk about. But learnings that will be particularly, I think, appropriate to folks who might be listening, and you have triggered one of them. It was very important to have these meetings going forward in close proximity to the G8 or to the G20. But what became very clear is how important it was to have them before the G7, G20 met, because then the statement produced, of course, could be given to the G20, the G7, and influence, we would hope, their decisions and their conversations. Great. Sounds like a great theory. But for all of us involved in social justice in any way, in peace concerns, it's also about our whole society. It's about collaboration. So one of the things that we learned, which nobody had understood and which faith communities are learning still, NGO communities are learning, but we're not the quickest off the mark always around this stuff, there was a meeting with what's called the G8 Sherpa, the staff people in Ottawa who are particularly putting together the G8 Summit. So there was a meeting well in advance of the 2010 Interfaith Leaders Summit here in Canada. And that meeting was really interesting because there was lots of willingness to hear what the faith communities have to say. And so when we're talking, we're talking broad faith communities representation. So, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Baha'i, Zoroastrians, Shinto tradition has been very strong, a tradition particularly based in Japan, also led by, wait for it, Metta, one of the World Federalists, who is a strong, and very prominent member of the Shinto community in Japan, but a strong and prominent World Federalist as well. And that would be too Mitsuo and Yoshinobu Miyake, the Reverends Mitsuo and Yoshinobu Miyake. Anyway, so all of the faith communities. So when you go before, or you meet with in their offices, the G8 Sherpas, and you talk about all of the millions of people represented by these faith traditions and the concerns that the faith traditions share in common with the issues before the G8, G7, G20, there was quite a positive reception. And I think we were surprised. Well, why were we surprised? Well, we have in our minds that there's sometimes an antipathy between, so-called government official representatives and the NGO community. And faith communities, of course, are a subset of the NGO community. But there was quite a good hearing. We were listened to, they were responded to, good questions were asked. It was clear the faith communities had done their homework, and this is another learning that we'll go back to. But the challenge that the G8 Sherpa posed said, now you understand, they said, that the statements, the agenda for these high-level government meetings are hammered out a year in advance. The decisions are pretty much mostly made by the time the summits happen. So it really...
The agenda or
both.
Even the positions they're going to take?
They're talking. They're talking all year ahead. We see they otherwise they can't do it. I mean, if you sort of think about it, they meet for how many days? 3 days. There's not the positions that come out of that can't be formulated in 3 or 4 days. That just isn't reasonable or possible. And then, of course, if there's a crisis and that has to be dealt with, that just makes the meeting even more difficult. So what they said to us, it was a great challenge to the NGO community, is that if you are serious, if you're really serious, it's not just about formulating your position and then kind of dropping it on the G8 or G20 2 days before, 1 day before, 3 days before the meetings. You need to get your statement, what you agree on, in draft form. It doesn't have to be finalized, but in draft form, you need to get the statement to us 9 months ahead of time. Now, the faith community world does not always move that quickly. The NGO world in general does not always move that quickly. It does in many sectors. But so that was a huge learning and a huge effort. But we did it. We did it. And we got the statement, and it meant, working electronically. It meant working with all these countries around the world. It meant a draft statement. It meant it got sent out. Everybody commented on it. We brought it back together. We would do rewrite after rewrite, send it out again. And so when the faith leaders came to Winnipeg, to the University of Winnipeg, they already knew what the draft was. And so there was more conversation, and it was very substantive. But we finalized, and the G8, the Canadian G8 office, already had a pretty good idea what we were going to say, which helped them and made them able to take us more seriously.
Now, what I need to know is how bold can you be if you're going to have a document that is a consensus, adopted by consensus of this whole community of different faiths. I mean, it's hard. It would be impossible to even get all the Christians on board with one common platform. But to what extent do you have to water down the kinds of proposals that you're going to make, or do you even try to make very specific proposals?
Well, we did.
And real policy statements, yep. This, and this, or do you go for everybody should play nicely together?
Nope. Obviously, we do believe people should play nicely together. That is a general good principle. But no, we were quite specific. And what that meant was, and I'll tell you how we did it. But what that meant was we were also taken very seriously by the G8 and the G20 because we displayed our expertise. We had climate experts working on some very specific points. We had arms control and peace and justice people working on some very specific points. But it's more about expertise. It's more about focus. So what we didn't try to do was cover too much. The statement is only, if you look up the 2010 one, and subsequent ones, some of them have been a bit longer, but I was very rigid about it could only be 4 pages long. Right. And it was about focus, focus, focus. So what are the places where we can see that we have a very good chance of getting good agreement, consensus, as you say, everything is about consensus. Well, the Millennium Development Goals were an obvious one. Now, it didn't start out that way. We had to do a lot of conversation. I mean, we started planning this it was a year and a half ahead of time. And my first conversations with the experts around the Millennium Development Goals were conversations in which they said they're very flawed. So we took the position and really worked with people. I had a lot of conversations that said, we can all agree that they're flawed, but we can also agree that there isn't anything better. And they've been agreed upon by the United Nations, which means that all of the countries of the world have already bought into them. So then if we as the faith traditions, not saying that they're perfect, and the same applies, of course, now it's the Sustainable Development Goals, but the same methodology applies. We're not saying they're perfect, but we're saying that it's a way that we can talk to each other and we can talk to the UN and we can talk to the countries of the world who have all agreed on them. And we can push countries to comply with what they have already agreed themselves. So Canada made commitments, and these are all very trackable. We worked in partnership, in close partnership with the Munk Center, with the G8, G20 research group at the Munk Center, and all of this stuff is very available online. What did Canada agree to specifically? How is Canada doing on those agreements? So each country's faith communities can hold their own country to account for what their own country has already agreed to.
Tell me, if I can be really rude.
Oh, go right ahead.
What are the most contentious topics that you had that you could not get those decisions about?
Nuclear weapons.
Hmm?
Nuclear weapons.
You couldn't get that?
No, we couldn't get that one. So we had 3 foci. One was the Millennium Development Goals. One was climate. And we were very specific about what we were asking for climate, which was the 0.2, not exceeding the 0.2 carbon emissions. And we had all of the documentation to back that up. The third grouping of issues was peace and security in the more traditional ways those are understood. And we couldn't get agreement on nuclear weapons. So instead of letting the summit fail, or instead of just throwing up our hands or creating a situation where there couldn't be consensus, what we did was say, all right, what can we agree on? So what we could agree on was the Arms Trade Treaty. What we could agree on was that small arms, and this comes very powerful, these kind of stories come out of Asia in particular, and some of the speakers, it just was enough to wring your heart when they talked about how many people have died in their countries because of small arms being smuggled illegally across borders. And that is the biggest peace and security scourge for them. And you see, everyone was in agreement that weapons should not be traded illegally across country borders. There was,
but even legally, I mean,
well, sure.
Right now, without I don't know how legal it is, but you know, anybody who wants to get guns in the U.S. seems to be able to do it. Yeah, anywhere they want to take them. I mean,
yeah. So
what happens? I don't.
Yeah, but we got everyone there agreeing to that, and then you take that to the G8 and G20, and the G8 G20 is forced to confront the fact that the faith leaders and the faith traditions representing billions of the world's people are in agreement on these points. It's not everything. It's not every point that any of us can imagine. But when you are able to represent billions of people, I'm not saying it changes everything. I'm not saying the world peace has broken out since then, but you get taken seriously. You get taken seriously. And that's, the NGO community is often considered and dismissed, frankly, for being so fragmented. And there are all kinds of reasons why we are, and diversity is really important in our lives and in our world. But what I learned about the advocacy was, in the first place, we can't just pretend that other parts of our society that we want to speak with and engage in dialogue with don't have their own concerns and deadlines, frankly. And so how do we work together? Which doesn't mean agreeing to anything that we are not going to agree to, but it is a respectful position to say, we want, you to listen to our issues. And then the G8 office says to us, great, and we're willing to listen. Mm-hmm. But you need to get us a statement 9 months ahead in order to facilitate that. Like that's the kind of conversation that NGOs haven't always had. Now, many are having those kind of conversations and more now, but it is about, which is not to say it's agreement. It's just talking about how the dialogue can be better is one way to put it. So there's one, that's a major learning that I continually talk to secular society, to NGO communities, to faith communities about, and that's really important. And World Federalists know this well. I mean, Fergus Watt, for example, our executive director in Canada, knows this well. He is an expert at talking with what he would call sometimes policy wonks, and talking with the various government representatives and increasing understanding and dialogue. So we learned that as the faith communities. That was an important part of the summit. So the summits continue, and we continue to talk with one another. At least from my perspective, I'm not as involved in it. I'm involved in different things, as I've also mentioned, and we'll get to a couple of those. But it is about, in my mind, focus is also important. Mm-hmm. Where are the places where we really want to stand? Or to use the Archimedes line, where are the places we really want to put our lever and can make the most difference? And one of them, to go back to that, is holding our own country's account around the Sustainable Development Goals. Where are we going to be in 2030 when we get to the deadline for the Sustainable Development Goals?
Tell me the procedure you go through, the process of bringing something to this leadership. What do you call it? Faith Leaders?
Interfaith Leaders Summit.
Okay. How do you go, if you've got to work a year in advance, practically? How would somebody put a proposal forward? How does it happen that a motion is brought to the attention of the group and discussed before? And how would you
do that? It's not as difficult as it sounds, and it's more difficult than it sounds. And it's consensus, remember, so not emotion. In Canada, we are privileged in that the relationships were strong and deep already. So, and we began a year and a half in advance. And so we were able to, because the relationships were built, because as the Canadian Council of Churches, we had very good ability to dialogue and converse with most of the major Christian leaders in the country, good connections with the other faith traditions, so that in the first place, we knew through years of working together what the major issues were. But we also, because we started talking, I built a coalition of 47 partners, and we started talking to each other a year and a half in advance. And it wasn't as difficult as you think, because when we understood the timelines, when we understood that the statement couldn't be long or it wouldn't get, the hearing that we were hoping for, when we understood that we needed to be focused, what's the art of the possible, it really wasn't that difficult. When we understood that we wanted to bring forward issues around which there was consensus, or, good steps towards consensus, but that also would relate to the rest of society as well, it really actually wasn't that difficult. And we're good listeners too. We can hear what people are saying and what they're concerned about.
So what would you say were the boldest measures that you could make? How much out in front of public opinion can you run, if at all? You
can make it pretty clear and pretty public how Canada's doing measuring up to its commitments to the Millennium Development Goals or the Sustainable Development Goals. I work, working with the Monk Center, the G20 research group. We did a Millennium Development Goals 101 cross-country tour. And of the 8 G8 countries, we would just do a simple quiz sometimes to start the conversation going and say, so of the 8 G8 countries, who's coming the closest to fulfilling the commitments they've made to the Millennium Development Goals?
What was the answer?
What?
What was the answer?
The United States. Surprised everybody.
Yeah.
And where was Canada in the pack? The Canadians are all hoping that Canada's near the top. Nope. At the bottom. At the middle. Canada was in the middle.
Really?
At the bottom, unfortunately, was Italy. Everyone's favorite country to vacation in, but not doing so well on the Millennium Development Goals. But this was back in 2010, so I can't speak to how they're doing now. But so that, that was pretty out there, because for many of us who have worked in peace and justice for a very long time, we have acknowledged an uncomfortable relationship with the United States and have tended to, now this was before Donald Trump, way before.
I was about to say.
I know. But it was in the time of George Bush. And in the time of George Bush, the United States was doing better on fulfilling commitments to alleviate suffering in the world than any other country. Now, you can be a cynic and you can say, well, they had more money and well, they did that, and all of that is also true. But it was, so that was in a way far out there, because we were disconcerting people's perceptions. Mm-hmm. We had, for instance, to go back to what I was saying about the membership of the Canadian Council of Churches, we had an evening on the Millennium Development Goals that was hosted by the Noor Center, which is an Ismaili Muslim center, and the Salvation Army. And they jointly hosted, and the Salvation Army would very much call itself an evangelical Christian tradition. And their head office is actually quite close to the Noor Center on Winford Drive. And the two of them hosted an evening that was packed and hosted a dinner to bring awareness. So that was, that was fairly out there in terms of how people see relationships. The climate stuff, I wouldn't say the climate stuff was kind of out there in terms of what most climate action groups are talking about. But we were solidly there, and all the faith communities agreeing to the 0.2, not going higher than the emissions, which of course we've all surpassed since then, unfortunately. But to say that for all the faith communities to come together and say that was a surprise.
How many of these leaders are there each time? I mean, and does it vary?
It varies tremendously. It depends on the host country, because there's diversity. So the host country really is the one organizing, and it varies tremendously. And there can be a higher percentage of leaders or a higher percentage of experts, or it really varies. But the point is that all the faith traditions are talking to each other and then speaking publicly and making public statements.
Do they bring not only the faith leaders, but also experts who say climate change experts?
Yeah, very much.
So
yeah, very much.
Dialogue that takes place there. How long does the whole meeting last?
Oh, a few days. Mm-hmm. A few days. not dissimilar. And there's there are websites but the thing is, so many people who are, again, of the thousands who are listening in are going to say, well, why have I never heard of them? Well, that's a good question. But, faith news is often, not reported. And faith leaders all agreeing with each other, it's the tensions that get more reported. So this, this continues. And so I can segue from this. I mean, I could talk about this forever, and just to let people know that the process won a global award for best practices in interfaith dialogue. And that
for having something to do with that.
Yeah, I submitted the application, frankly, and had all the documentation and spent my Christmas holidays doing it to make a very tight deadline. Yeah. But that was a privilege to do. And so one of the pieces that remains in Canada, now the meetings are happening, as I said, in different places around the world. And there's been a meeting in China, and there's been a meeting in Istanbul and Germany. That's a good question. I do know that, Metta, but I can't remember off the top of my head where the next one is. But if people sort of Google search the G20, and particularly Brian Adams and out of Griffith University, it'll I'm sure come up. Anyway, where I was going with that was to say that in Canada, one of the ongoing pieces is the Canadian Interfaith Conversation. So it grew out of the 47-member partnership that hosted the Interfaith Leaders Summit. So they have a great website. So Canadian Interfaith Conversation, so CIC. People can go to that website as well, and that's the residual body, which is doing great work in Canada in similar kinds of ways, bringing people together, expanding conversations, working with youth, doing some really important initiatives. So I can segue from that into the Parliament of the World's Religions, which is coming to Toronto, as you said in your introduction, first week of November.
Could I interrupt?
Yes. Oh, please.
The connection between these two things is this leadership summit related, or the same people involved with organizing the Parliament of World Religions, or are these separate entities?
They're completely separate entities, but there's certainly some crossover in terms of organization and people involved, for sure. And the Canadian Interfaith Conversation will be doing a presentation at the Parliament of the World's Religions, for instance. So people who are passionate about faith communities talking with one another for the sake of the whole world, and doing so, in humility from a knowledge base. There are obviously people who are working on both. But the Parliament of the World Religions is a separate thing. It has been running since 1893, which surprises people.
Oh,
yes, 1893. Now there was a big parliament in 1893, and then there wasn't one for another very long time. But this is the 7th Parliament. It's the largest global gathering of the faith traditions in the world. That's what's implied by global gathering. What's really unique is that it's the first time ever in Canada, ever. It's been all over the world, but it's never been in Canada before, and it's in Toronto. And we were chosen. It's a bit like an Olympic bid. You put in a bid to host the Parliament, and we were chosen because Toronto is the most diverse city in the world.
Really?
Yes. And so we won the bid, so to speak. It will be at the Metro Convention Center for those of you who live in Toronto. Your listeners live in Toronto. It's November 1st to 7th. November 1st to 7th.
Who gets to go?
Anybody who wants to go can just register. Parliament of the World's Religions website. Just go to the Parliament of the World's Religions, click register, and come. And
that stuff. Tell me about the program.
The program is quite incredible. A huge amount of work. And so when you said in the introduction that I was, the prime organizer, no, I'm the chair. I'm the co-chair of the Toronto board. There is an office in Chicago because it's based out of Chicago. And there are staff there who are just working night and day to pull this off. Those of us in Canada, and there are Canadian staff as well, are also working night and day to pull this off. But it is a number of different things. There are big name plenary speakers. So Maud Barlow will be there. I got an email today from Maud Barlow as we confirm her speaking slot. John Ralston Saul is coming to speak. Payam Akavan, who was last year's Massey lecturer, who speaks on the situation of the Baha'i in Iran and the persecution, is going to be one of the speakers. There are these kinds of major names. Margaret Atwood is coming to speak as well on climate and the impact of climate around women in particular. So there are big name speakers who, of course, everybody will want to come and hear. Is also the opportunity that anybody could submit. The deadline is now passed, but anybody could submit a proposal to do a workshop or a panel. And so there will be 500 of those, 500 of those. So you can see why the scheduling conversation is quite a mammoth one. But there will be films. For instance, Salt and Light Television Network in Toronto is the Roman Catholic television media network, and they are, a lot of people have heard of this. It's a film called The Francis Effect, and what the effect of Pope Francis has been globally on every kind of way of thinking of the diversity of the globe. And it's quite a well-known film it's going to be shown at TIFF, I think, as well, or something like that. Anyway, but there's film, and there are arts presentations, and the Indigenous opening ceremonies are going to be deeply moving and representative of Indigenous people from Canada and the US and all around the world. Mm-hmm. And Indigenous people from north of the Arctic Circle in Norway, Sweden, Finland, those other countries. And it's going to be, and we'll start at Lake Ontario, and the water will be brought up to the Metro Convention Center. There's going to be a sacred fire, which will be facilitated by Indigenous folk throughout the entire Parliament. So that's hugely important. Of course, the Prime Minister is invited. The Lieutenant Governor will be making opening remarks. The Mayor, the city has been very supportive. And it's 125th anniversary, but the first time in Canada. So anyone can come. There, of course, there's a registration fee. There has to be. The Parliament has to break even, of course. But it will be. We will not see. Now, you and I still want to believe that we are quite young, and we're still going to believe that. But we will not see this again in Canada in our lifetime. Mm-hmm. It will not be here. So it's very, very unique and a huge privilege. The Sikh community will be offering a langar, and that means that they will feed everyone there one meal a day. So they're feeding 10,000 people a day. The organization, I saw this in Barcelona. I was one of the presenters when the Parliament met in Barcelona. The pots are unbelievable. The size of the pots are the size of my dining room where I'm sitting as I speak to you. But that's part of their gift, and their commitment is, and that will be open to anyone. Anyone can come and be fed once a day. So there's a sacred music concert night. There will be all kinds of special events. I mean, so many that people will have a hard time choosing what they're going to go to. There are events for children. There's 6 streams to the Parliament, and I wrote them down so I could be sure to not miss a single one. There's a woman's track. There is a track countering war, hatred, and violence. There's a climate action track, Indigenous peoples tracks, next generation, that's a youth track, and then there's a justice track. And so the different presenters and the different workshops and panels are put into the most appropriate track, and each day will feature one of those tracks.
Okay, now that is kind of a public event for, yes. It's for ordinary folks, right? It's
everybody. Yep.
Is there any intention of coming up with a document, a statement, a proposal at the end, or do each of these separate tracks try to develop anything?
It's more about what we're really focusing on this year is leaving a legacy. And we all know, and this is endemic to academic conferences and NGO conferences and faith gatherings, that you can have a wonderful, strong event that says all kinds of important things. And then what? And then what? So it's more about figuring out what the and then what is going to be for Canada, for Toronto, and we're still working on that. But leaving a legacy and having people able to go forward with the goals. Now, there's a document towards a global ethic, and that was Hans Kung was one of the writers, and it's been since 1993, I think. I may not have the date quite right of the document towards a global ethic, but certainly that's a foundational document for the Parliament. But we're not going to come up with another document subsequent to that, but it will be framed around to a great extent around what is in that document. But then going forward, and that's what I'm very committed to, and will continue to work on that after the Parliament. How do we take this kind of gathering forward so that it isn't just people go home on the 7th of November and, then what?
Okay, well, now, do you see any major shift taking place in the thinking of the people organizing this, in the kinds of goals and agenda that they want to put forward? What is the kind of evolution of the ideology of this movement?
That's a very good question. And I don't know if you want to call it ideology, but certainly towards more of a shift to the concrete. And the interfaith movement in general has been moving more that way over. Sometimes I talk about the fact that in one way you can define it, we're in sort of a third generation of the modern interfaith movement. And interfaith dialogue's been going on since for millennia, you could say. Two of my kids actually have done subsequent work in Christian-Muslim dialogue from the 7th century because it was very real. It was very, very real. But in the modern interfaith movement, we're probably in about the third stage. And the first stage some time ago, and in 1893, for instance, when the Parliament started, it was just really miraculous to get everybody in the same room at the same time and to get people meeting together and willing to learn about each other and each other's faith traditions and each other's countries. And it was primarily Christian back then. Certainly there is what you can see in terms of shift is that's, just talking to each other isn't seen as nearly enough anymore. How are we going to work together? Okay, we can all agree that working together is good, but how are we going to actually do it? What the concrete outcomes going to be? How are we going to do it? And how are we going to do it in an ongoing way? There are shifts in terms of representation. So the early parliaments were just Christian. Then it was really easy and still can be fairly easy to bring the monotheistic traditions, the Abrahamic traditions together. So to get Jews, Christians, and Muslims talking together. We've got lots of experience with that. There are tensions, to be sure, and everyone knows that. But there are starting points too. Well, okay, we're doing much more conversation with Eastern traditions and highlighting those, much more, and trying to make sure that those are very much lifted up as major participants in these conversations. So that's another really important change, over time, and looking upon the regions of the world as all, kind of, I don't want to say equal, because that's just not the right term. It sort of trivializes it, but the contributions that all the faith traditions have to bring, and the long and deep history of Zoroastrianism is an ancient tradition, Buddhism is an ancient tradition, Confucianism, there are all of these traditions that are becoming better known in the West, and have always been a part of the Parliament, but are even more so now. And of course, there is a big difference in terms of, no surprise, I think, Metta, in terms of how many of the faith leaders are women now. In 1893, I think there were like 2 women there in the whole Parliament. That will not be the case now. That kind of shift is hugely different.
This is such an interesting prospect. I'm going to sign up and I'll go. I really want to hear more about this. And it's time for us to sign off now.
All right.
I'm just so glad that I've had a chance to get caught up with you, Erin.
Well, I'm just delighted with the invitation. Thank you. And for those listening, please follow Metta's work, because she is doing wonderful and creative work around a wide variety of issues. And so please support it and follow it.
Thank you. And I will reciprocate the flattery by suggesting that if you want to go on a wonderful tour of Israel and Palestine, Karen does this.
I do it with, I just need to say, now it's being transmogrified, as Calvin and Hobbes, the comic strip, would say, into a course. So if you look on the website of St. George's College in Jerusalem, you will see in the next weeks, a month, you will see the materials start to appear. So it's going to be at St. George's College in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, in March.
Oh, boy. Well, okay. So you can also, you can get in touch with Karen, because I know you have a Facebook page. And if you go to her Facebook page, and she's Karen Hamilton, you can find a way to send a direct message to her.
Send a direct message, please.
And she tells me, please do not post recipes.
Yeah, I confess that to Metta, that my knowledge of technology is limited, but I do know how to take off postings that are not difficult or challenging, but that just don't promote the kind of focus I'm trying to promote in my Facebook page. So send me a message. Don't post on the timeline.
You should see the silly things I post. Yeah, I'll look at your page if you go look at mine, which is pretty weird sometimes. Anyway, this has been fun.
It's been fun, Metta. Thank you.
Right. See you guys next week, I hope. Bye.
All right. Okay.
Bye.
Now I have to figure out how to turn this off.
I don't know.
Stop video. Stop. How about stop